The diner was nearly empty as Sarah wiped down the counter, humming along to an old country song crackling through the speakers. It was past midnight, the dead zone between the late dinner rush and the first wave of early risers. She enjoyed these quiet hours, a brief lull before her shift dragged her back to refills and orders barked over the counter. That's when they walked in. 3 teenagers shuffled through the door, looking lost and out of place. They were tall, lanky, with clothes hanging oddly from their bodies as if they didn't quite understand how to wear them. Sarah's first thought was that they were cosplaying some sci-fi show, maybe, but there was something different about them. Their skin had a strange sheen under the diner lights, and they moved in a way that felt wrong. She couldn't put her finger on it. They slid awkwardly into a booth, casting nervous glances at each other and around the diner. Sarah approached with her notepad, smiling. "Hey there. You 3 hungries?" The tallest one, a boy with silver hair and eyes too bright for this world, nodded uncertainly. They all looked exhausted, with dark rings under their eyes and tense, jumpy movements, as if they were bracing for someone to yell at them. Sarah softened. She'd seen runaways and homeless kids wander in before, desperate for a warm meal and a few hours' respite. "Well, what'll it be?" she asked, trying to keep her tone casual. The trio exchanged glances, looking completely stumped. The one on the right, taller than the other 2, with a faint blue tint to her skin, pointed to a picture on the menu, though her fingers trembled slightly. It was a simple burger and fries. "Good choice," Sarah said, jotting it down. 3 burgers, 3 fries, coming up. She glanced at them, pausing. "Y'all got money, right?" Silence. The teens fumbled, exchanging anxious looks, and Sarah felt her heart sink. She'd been there herself, empty pockets and empty stomach, the world feeling cold and unforgiving. She sighed, waving a hand. "Don't worry about it. Tonight's on me." They didn't respond immediately, just blinked at her as if she'd spoken another language. Then, the silver-eyed one managed a small, awkward smile, and the others followed, each of them grateful in a way she rarely saw. Their eyes gleamed with what looked like relief, and Sarah couldn't help but feel a warm satisfaction. When she returned with their food, they devoured it quickly, savoring each bite as if it were their first meal in days. She hovered nearby, making small talk, though they mostly nodded in silence, visibly struggling with their words. "Thank you," one of them finally managed to say in a thick accent. "You are kind," Sarah chuckled, waving it off. "It's just a burger, kid. Don't worry about it." But as she watched them eat, she couldn't shake the feeling there was more to their story than she'd first thought. She didn't know who these kids were or where they'd come from, but something told her this wouldn't be the last time she'd see them. The trio began appearing every few days, always late at night when the diner was nearly empty. Each time, they looked a little less weary, a little more comfortable in their skin, but they still wore the same clothes, slightly less disheveled but unmistakably out of place. Sarah took to feeding them without asking questions. She'd make small talk, but they rarely gave much back. The one with silver eyes, who she'd started calling Silas, would nod with his small, awkward smile, clearly the most confident of the 3. The girl with a bluish tint, Luna, rarely spoke, her bright eyes darting around like she was always waiting for trouble. The third, Rai, was the quietest, his expressions more curious, his gaze lingering on mundane things like ketchup bottles and napkin holders, as if he were trying to decode them. One night, Sarah decided to test her instincts. "So," she said, as she set a plate of fries on the table, "you kids run away from somewhere?" "Family trouble." She watched them carefully, curious for any reaction. Silas stiffened, his eyes flitting to the others. They exchanged glances, a silent conversation passing between them. Then he met her gaze, something almost defiant in his expression. "We are not from here?" His tone was cautious, like he was skirting around something. Sarah's heart twisted. Maybe they were refugees, or had escaped some abusive situation. She couldn't imagine what it took to survive out here alone, but whatever it was, she felt a growing sense of duty to look out for them, even if she could barely afford it. She set down a bowl of soup in front of Luna, who murmured a quiet "thank you" and seemed genuinely moved by the small gesture. So, where are you from, exactly? Sarah pressed, trying to keep her tone light. Luna looked up, frowning in thought. Far, she said, her accent thick and strange, almost musical. Very far. We had to leave quickly. Sarah took this in, nodding slowly. The story was clearly complicated, but something in their eyes told her they'd seen things no teenager should. It wasn't her business to pry. She'd learned long ago that sometimes survival stories were best left untold. Listen, she said softly, if you ever need a break, you're welcome here. Just keep it under the radar, okay? Rai looked up then, a flicker of emotion breaking through his quiet demeanor. Why are you kind to us? He asked, his voice quiet, almost vulnerable. Sarah blinked, surprised by the question. Why wouldn't I be? She replied. Everyone deserves a warm meal now and then. The trio shared another look, but this time, there was something softer in their faces. She knew they didn't trust her completely, but maybe, just maybe, her small acts of kindness were starting to get through. They began opening up in small ways. They spoke of leaving behind a place of constant war in halting phrases that Sarah took as metaphors. Still, there were enough cracks in their story to keep her guessing. And yet, as they dug into their food that night, she knew one thing for sure. Whatever they'd been through, whatever strange journey had brought them to her, she was determined to help. The diner was quiet one evening, the usual hum of neon lights casting a warm glow over the empty booths. Sarah wiped down the counter, glancing at the clock as she anticipated the arrival of her unusual patrons. The trio had been regulars for nearly 2 years, and though they still held tightly to their secrets, Sarah felt an unspoken bond forming between them. But that night, the air was different. A sense of unease settled over her as the door swung open, and Silas, Luna, and Rai entered, their expressions more serious than usual. The light-hearted banter that typically filled the diner was replaced with an ominous silence. As they slid into their booth, Sarah noticed the nervous glances they exchanged. Everything okay? She asked, concern creeping into her voice. Silas glanced toward the door, his silver eyes darting around the diner before landing on her. We need to talk, he said, his voice low. Sure, what's going on? Sarah replied, pulling out her notepad and pen, her heart racing. Luna hesitated, then took a deep breath. We're in trouble. People are looking for us, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Sarah's stomach nodded. What do you mean? Who's looking for you? Rai shifted uncomfortably, his eyes downcast. The ones we ran from. They've come to Earth, he said, the weight of his words sinking into the booth, like lead. Why here? Why now? Sarah asked, her pulse quickening. Earth is a safe place for us, Silas said, meeting her gaze with urgency. Or it was. But they're tracking us, and we've been careless. Just then, the diner door swung open, and 2 men entered, their demeanor cold and purposeful. They wore dark coats that blended into the shadows, their eyes scanning the room with a predatory intensity. Sarah's heart dropped as she recognized the look. They were looking for the teens. Hide, she said urgently, her voice barely above a whisper. She gestured toward the back of the diner, where the supply closet lay. No. Silas shook his head, his expression fierce. We can't run. We'll fight. We're not afraid. But I am. Sarah shot back, her voice rising. If they find you here, I could lose my job or worse. Silas hesitated, and in that moment, she saw the flicker of a decision in his eyes. We need to go, he said finally, turning to the others. We can't stay here. The trio scrambled to their feet, and Sarah grabbed a couple of extra burgers and fries from the kitchen, stuffing them into a bag. Take this, she said, her heart racing. It's not much, but you'll need it. As they moved toward the back exit, the men at the front spotted them. One called out, Hey, you. Panic surged through Sarah. Go. Now, she urged, her heart pounding in her chest. Silas and Luna glanced back one last time, and in that moment, Sarah felt the weight of their shared experiences hang between them. She'd been their lifeline, but now she could only watch as they disappeared into the alley, swallowed by the shadows. As the men rushed toward her, she braced herself, putting on a brave face. She had to protect them, even if it meant standing alone against the storm that was coming. The diner's fluorescent lights buzzed ominously above her, a reminder of how quickly everything could change. The days turned into weeks, and Sarah found herself haunted by the absence of Silas, Luna, and Rai. Each night she stood behind the counter, scanning the diner's entrance, half expecting to see them walk through the door. But they never came. The diner felt emptier, without their awkward laughter and grateful smiles, and the weight of worry settled heavily on her shoulders.
What had happened to them?
Had they escaped the dangers they faced, or had the men who came for them caught up? Then, one quiet evening, as the clock ticked toward closing time, the door creaked open and Sarah's heart raced. She looked up, holding her breath, and there they stood. The trio appeared haggard but alive, their clothes tattered but their spirits unbroken. Relief flooded through her as she rushed to them, nearly knocking over a stack of menus. "Where have you been?" she exclaimed, enveloping them in a tight hug. They looked surprised but quickly relaxed into her embrace. "Just laying low," Silas replied, his voice steady despite the tension in his eyes. "We're safe for now." Sarah stepped back, scanning their faces. They wore expressions of both gratitude and sorrow, and it made her heart ache.
"I was worried about you."
"I thought." "We had to leave the diner," Luna interrupted, her voice heavy. "But we couldn't leave without coming back to thank you." "Thank me?" Sarah shook her head. "I did what anyone would do." "No," Rai said, stepping forward, his expression earnest. "You didn't have to help us. You gave us more than food. You gave us hope. We want to repay you." With that, Silas reached into his pocket and pulled out a small metallic object. It shimmered in the dim light, shifting colors like oil on water. "This is for you. It's a rare resource from our planet, worth more than you can imagine." Sarah's eyes widened as she took the object, running her fingers over its smooth surface. "I can't accept this," she said, shaking her head. "This must be valuable to you. You need it." "We have no use for it here," Silas insisted. "You gave us food and shelter when we had nothing. This is our way of showing you how much your kindness meant to us." A lump formed in Sarah's throat as she gazed at the shimmering object. "I don't want to take something that belongs to you. You're my friends. Friends help each other," Luna said softly, a hint of a smile breaking through her serious demeanor. "Please take it. It will change your life." With tears in her eyes, Sarah nodded, unable to voice her gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered, knowing she would cherish the memory of their time together more than any material possession. As they prepared to leave, Silas placed a hand on her shoulder.
"You're stronger than you know, Sarah. You'll find your way, just as we found ours."
With one last look, the trio turned and disappeared into the night. Sarah stood frozen for a moment, clutching the metallic object tightly in her hand. She felt a strange sense of emptiness, but also a flicker of hope. Months later, after a scientist stumbled upon the object during an exhibit and offered her a fortune for it, Sarah realized how right Silas had been. The money transformed her life, allowing her to chase her dreams and escape the weight of her circumstances, yet no amount of money could replace the memories of those 2 years spent in the diner, where kindness had transcended barriers and forged a bond that would last a lifetime. In her heart, she knew that their friendship was the real treasure.